The youth of Great Britain is staring down the barrel of a cruel and manipulated financial landscape which will ensure that Charles Schwab's prediction of "you will own nothing and be happy" is slowly making its way to becoming this generation's reality. What if I told you that in Britain's biggest cities right now, single people working full-time jobs will never own a home? Not in 10 years, not in 20, never. And before you think this is just another story about lazy millennials who can't stop buying coffee, the numbers reveal something far more disturbing. This isn't happening because people aren't trying hard enough. It's happening because the system has fundamentally broken. And what's coming next will shock you even more. The UK housing market has reached a point that seems almost impossible to believe. In London and Bristol, if you're renting and earning an average salary, you're actually losing money every single month after paying rent and basic living costs. That's right, you have a deficit, you're going backwards. Recent analysis shows that the average London renter takes home around £3,000 monthly, but between rent at over £2,000 and basic living expenses, they're left with nothing. Actually, they're left £37 in the red every single month. But here's where it gets really interesting. While everyone's been focused on London, something completely different is happening in the northeast. Property prices there have surged by over 14% in just 1 year. Meanwhile, London's barely moving at 1%. The housing crisis isn't what you think it is. It's not uniform. It's not simple. And the solutions being pushed by politicians? They're missing the point entirely. If you want to stay ahead of the latest UK property and housing news, the stories that actually matter, and the trends that will affect your financial future, smash that like button right now and subscribe to Property Reporter. We're cutting through the noise and bringing you the facts that the mainstream outlets won't tell you. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why everything you thought you knew about the housing market is wrong. The average house price in the UK right now sits at around £270,000. Sounds somewhat reasonable, right? But let's break down what that actually means for someone trying to buy their first home. The average first-time buyer deposit in Britain is now over £61,000. That's 20% of the purchase price. 20%. For most people in their 20s and early 30s, that figure alone is devastating enough. But in London, the average deposit has climbed to over £124,000, more than double the national average. Here's the reality that nobody wants to talk about. If you're earning the UK average salary of around £33,000 per year and you manage to save 10% of that, which is incredibly optimistic given rent and living costs, you're putting away £3,300 annually. At that rate, it would take you more than 18 years to save for a national average deposit. In London, you're looking at nearly 40 years. By that point, house prices will have increased so dramatically that your savings won't even matter. You'll be chasing a target that moves faster than you can run. Recent research examined exactly how long it takes for different groups to save for deposits. Single people living rent-free with family in London would need 16.7 years of dedicated saving to afford a deposit. In Bristol, it's 13.5 years. But if you're renting, the math becomes almost cruel. After paying rent averaging over £2,000 monthly in London, plus another £1,000 in living expenses, single earners on average income literally cannot save. The numbers don't work. It's not about discipline or sacrifice. It's mathematically impossible. And this brings us to something that most people completely missed. The regions seeing the strongest house price growth right now are actually the more affordable areas. The North East, North West and Scotland are experiencing growth rates multiple times higher than expensive southern regions. Why? Because people can actually afford to buy there. The market is functioning. In the unaffordable zones, everything has essentially frozen. There's a decade-high level of property choice for buyers in expensive areas because sellers can't find anyone who can afford to pay their asking prices. The market is screaming at us that prices have become detached from what real people can actually pay. Then came April 2025, and thousands of hopeful first-time buyers got hit with a bombshell they didn't see coming. The government had temporarily raised the stamp duty threshold for first-time buyers to £425,000 back in 2022. This meant If you were buying your first home under that amount, you paid zero in stamp duty. It was one of the few lifelines available. Everyone knew it would end eventually, but when it did, the impact was immediate and brutal. From April 1st, that threshold crashed back down to £300,000. Overnight, a first-time buyer purchasing a £400,000 home went from paying nothing in stamp duty to owing £5,000. For someone purchasing at £425,000, the bill jumped even higher. These aren't small amounts for people who've already stretched every penny to scrape together a deposit. For many, that extra £5,000 or £6,000 was the difference between buying and giving up entirely. The property market saw a massive rush in March as buyers desperately tried to complete before the deadline. Transactions spiked as people raced to get everything finalised. Then, in April, sales collapsed by 66%. That's the biggest drop following a stamp duty change in modern history. When similar changes happened before, the falls were around 50 to 60%. This was worse. Why? Because buyers are more cautious now. The economic backdrop is shakier. Wages haven't kept up. Mortgage rates, while better than their peak, are still significantly higher than a few years ago. People are tapped out. But here's what makes this truly revealing. The government knew this would happen. They announced it well in advance. The question is, what was the goal? Some argue it was a revenue measure, that the Treasury needed the extra stamp duty income. Others suggest it was meant to cool an overheating market. But cooling what market? The affordable end where first-time buyers operate has been struggling, not booming. The only segment that's been consistently strong is the luxury market, where wealthy buyers, often international, continue purchasing regardless of tax changes. So who really benefited from this policy shift? Not the young families trying to get on the ladder. The stamp duty change exposed something deeper. The housing market has split into two completely separate worlds. In one world, wealthy buyers continue transacting, often purchasing multiple properties, barely noticing tax increases. In the other world, ordinary earners are being systematically priced out, watching as each policy change pushes ownership further beyond reach, and the gap between these two worlds is growing wider every single month. Now, let's talk about the trap that's keeping millions of people stuck. Renting in Britain has become a financial black hole. The average monthly rent in England has hit £1,410. In London, it's nearly £2,740. Wales is seeing rent increases of over 7% annually. The North East, despite having the lowest absolute rents, is experiencing the fastest growth rate at over 9%. Rents are rising everywhere, and they're rising faster than wages. Here's the cruel mathematics of it. Research shows that renters aged 19 to 29 are spending 34% of their income on housing costs. For low earners, that figure explodes to over 70%. The old financial rule said you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on housing. In 2025, that rule is dead. It's been obliterated. When you're spending 40 to 70% of your income just keeping a roof over your head, saving for a deposit becomes fantasy. The average renter has seen their annual housing costs increase by over £2,500 compared to just 3 years ago. That's £2,500 that could have gone toward a deposit, toward building a future. Instead, it's disappeared into rent payments that build equity for landlords, not tenants. And it gets worse. Housing benefit has been frozen. Universal credit is increasing by only 1.7% in 2025, while rents surge by 5 to 9%. The gap between what support covers and what rent actually costs is exploding. Experts predict this affordability gap will hit 17% by the end of 2025. That means low-income renters will face an average shortfall of over £100 per month between their housing benefit and their actual rent. By 2029, forecasts suggest that gap will reach 25% or £180 monthly. What happens to those people? Many face homelessness. Temporary accommodation is already at record levels. The crisis isn't coming, it's already here, and it's accelerating. But there's another layer to the rental trap that doesn't get discussed enough. Landlords have been leaving the market in significant numbers over the past few years due to tax changes and increased regulation. This reduces supply exactly when demand is surging. You'd think this would be the perfect time for institutional investors and build-to-rent developments to fill the gap. But new rental properties hit their sharpest decline since the pandemic in mid-2025. Supply is shrinking while demand grows. Basic economics tells you what happens next. Prices keep climbing until they hit what's called an affordability ceiling, the point where renters literally cannot pay more without collapsing. Several regions are approaching that ceiling right now. When it's hit, rents don't fall. People just get evicted or become homeless. Let me give you a number that should terrify everyone thinking about housing in Britain. 2.2 million. That's how many first-time buyers are missing from the property market since the 2008 financial crisis. These are people who, under normal historical circumstances, would have purchased homes by now. They had jobs, they saved what they could, they did everything right. But the system failed them. The market moved beyond their reach and they got left behind. The average age of a first-time buyer in England is now 33 years and 10 months. A decade ago, it was a year younger. In 2007, before the financial crisis, it was more than 3 years younger. People are being forced to wait longer and longer, watching as property prices climb while they try desperately to save enough for a deposit. In London, the average first-time buyer is nearly 35. These aren't teenagers complaining about not getting instant gratification. These are people in their 30s, often with established careers, who still can't access home ownership. Here's something even more disturbing. Analysis shows that if a first-time buyer today manages to purchase a property with a typical mortgage, they won't be mortgage-free until they're 62 years and 10 months old. Think about that. You finally buy a home in your mid-30s after years of saving and sacrifice. You take out a 25 or 30-year mortgage because that's what's required to make the payments remotely affordable. You'll be paying it off until you're eligible for a pension. There's no building wealth in your 40s and 50s. There's just decades of debt. This has created what's now known as generation rent. These aren't people who choose to rent because they prefer flexibility or urban living. These are individuals and families who are permanently locked out of ownership. The numbers are stark. Only 8% of people aged 25 to 34 can afford to save a 10% deposit based on current house prices and wages. 8%. That means 92% of an entire generation cannot realistically access the property ladder without significant family help, inheritance, or some other external financial intervention. Research has found that home ownership is increasingly determined not by work ethic or financial discipline, but by circumstance. Do you have parents who can gift you a deposit? Did you inherit money? Do you have a partner whose income can be combined with yours to boost mortgage affordability? If the answer to these questions is no, your chances of ever owning a home have become vanishingly small. The system has evolved into one where property ownership is passed down through families, not earned through labour. It's becoming hereditary. The social implications of this are enormous. Home ownership has historically been tied to stability, to starting families, to feeling invested in communities. When an entire generation is denied that, what happens? Birth rates fall. People delay having children. Community cohesion weakens. Mental health deteriorates under the constant stress of insecure housing and financial precariousness. This isn't just an economic issue. It's a social crisis that will define Britain for decades. Now here's where the housing crisis starts to look really strange. The market has fractured into completely different realities depending on where you look. The North East has experienced house price growth of 14.3% over the past year. The North West and Scotland are seeing strong growth of over 4%. Meanwhile, London managed less than 1%. Some areas saw prices actually fall. Coastal regions like Torridge dropped by over 4.5%. What's happening here? The simple explanation is affordability. In regions where houses cost £200,000 or less, people on median incomes can actually buy. The market functions. Buyers exist. Sales happen. In London and the South East, where average prices hover around £300,000 to £500,000, ordinary people have been completely priced out. The only buyers left are those with substantial wealth, and there aren't enough of them to sustain robust market activity, so prices stagnate or fall. There's a fascinating dynamic in the most expensive areas right now. Property choice is at a decade-high level. Translation? Tons of homes are sitting on the market, not selling. Sellers who bought at peak prices or who need to move for work are stuck. They can't find buyers willing to pay their asking prices. Some have been forced to reduce prices significantly. Others have withdrawn their properties and decided not to move. The entire system has seized up because prices and wages have diverged so dramatically that the market can't function. Meanwhile, up north, things are different. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Newcastle are seeing regeneration, business investment, and job creation. Combined with much lower property prices, this creates actual demand from real buyers. People can afford to purchase, the market moves. But here's the uncomfortable question. If you're being forced to move to the north because southern prices are insane, but your job, your family, and your life are all in the south, is that really a solution? Or is it just geographic displacement forced by economic inequality? Scotland presents a particularly interesting case. The country implemented rent controls for a period, capping how much landlords could increase rents for existing tenants. The goal was to protect renters from exploitation. What happened? Some landlords left the market, reducing supply. New rental properties became scarcer. When the controls were lifted, rents surged. The policy was well-intentioned but struggled against the fundamental problem of insufficient housing supply. You can regulate prices all you want, but if there aren't enough homes for everyone who needs one, the underlying crisis remains. Late 2025 saw something unusual happen in the UK property market. Activity ground to a halt about 6 to 8 weeks earlier than the usual pre-Christmas slowdown. Why? Budget uncertainty. The government had announced a major budget for November, and speculation was rampant about potential property tax changes. Would they increase council tax bands? Would they replace stamp duty with an annual property tax? Would they add capital gains tax on expensive property purchases? None of this actually happened, but the speculation alone was enough to freeze decision-making. Buyers at the early stages of their search paused. Why commit to a purchase when the tax landscape might change dramatically in a few weeks? Sellers held off listing properties for the same reason. Estate agents reported the sharpest drop in buyer demand and new listings in years. The entire market essentially stopped, waiting to see what the Chancellor would announce. This reveals something crucial about the current housing market. It's incredibly fragile. Confidence is brittle. People are so financially stretched, so uncertain about the future, that even the hint of policy changes causes them to freeze. Compare this to 10 or 15 years ago, when the market had momentum, when buyers felt confident about job security and income growth. Back then, speculation about tax changes might have caused a brief pause, but activity would resume quickly. Now, the pause extends for months. The market has lost its resilience because participants have lost their financial buffers. The political response to the housing crisis has been remarkably consistent across parties and decades. Build more houses, just build more. The current government has committed to building 1.5 million homes. Previous governments had similar targets. The logic seems obvious. If we're short on housing, build more housing. Problem solved. But there's a fundamental issue with this thinking that almost nobody wants to acknowledge. Britain is not an economy with unlimited unused resources sitting idle. We don't have millions of construction workers twiddling their thumbs waiting for someone to give them a job. We don't have vast stockpiles of concrete and steel gathering dust. Resources are finite, and they're controlled by people and companies that make economic decisions based on profit. If you're a construction company or a developer right now, what kind of housing are you going to build? Look at the economic landscape. Government finances are strained. The working class is impoverished. The middle class is squeezed. But the wealthy, they're doing better than ever. The richest segments of society have seen their wealth explode over the past decade. If you're a rational developer, You're going to build luxury housing for wealthy buyers because that's where the money is. You're going to build penthouses, not affordable family homes. You're going to focus on central London, not northern towns. You're going to maximise profit, which means targeting those who can pay premium prices. For affordable housing aimed at first-time buyers, developers will use the cheapest materials and methods possible because they know buyers have no leverage. People desperate to get on the property ladder will accept whatever they can get. This leads to a race to the bottom in terms of quality. Remember the Grenfell Tower disaster? That exposed how corners had been cut on building safety across the country. Affordable housing developments were using dangerous materials to save money. That's not an accident. That's the logical outcome when you tell developers to build cheaply for buyers who can't afford to be choosy. So when politicians say, build, 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 the question becomes, build what, for whom, and with whose money? If the answer is luxury housing for the rich built by companies maximising profit, that doesn't solve the affordability crisis. It makes it worse by consuming resources that could theoretically be used differently. And the idea that we should just slash regulations and planning requirements to speed up building, that's how you get Grenfell. That's how you get unsafe, poor quality housing that will become slums within a generation. There's another problem with the build more narrative. Asset prices have been rising across the board for years. It's not just housing. Gold prices have more than doubled since the start of the pandemic. Stock markets are at all-time highs. Land prices have surged. Luxury art, classic cars, farmland, every hard asset you can name has increased dramatically in value. If the housing crisis were truly just about not building enough houses, why would all these other assets be skyrocketing too? The uncomfortable answer is that this is fundamentally a story about wealth concentration and inequality. When a small segment of society accumulates vast amounts of wealth, they invest it in assets. They buy property, stocks, land, gold, anything that holds value. This drives up asset prices across the board. Ordinary people find themselves competing with billionaires and multimillionaires for ownership of homes. It's not a fair competition. It was never going to be a fair competition. The idea that you can build your way out of this without addressing the massive wealth inequality driving it is fantasy. Look at the rental market dynamics right now. Rental yields for landlords have climbed to 6% nationally, with some regions exceeding 7.5%. Returns have improved significantly over recent years as rents have surged while house prices grew more modestly. This has attracted more buy-to-let investment. The number of new buy-to-let mortgages increased by 60% in the year leading to early 2025. Wealthy individuals and institutional investors are piling back into rental property because the returns are attractive. What does this mean for renters and first-time buyers? It means they're competing for properties against people who can afford to pay cash, who can offer over asking price, who don't need mortgages. They're competing against investors who view housing as a financial asset, not as homes. The more concentrated wealth becomes, the more this dynamic intensifies. Every property purchased by an investor is one less property available for someone who wants to actually live in it. Some will point to the government's various schemes aimed at helping first-time buyers. The Mortgage Guarantee Scheme allows deposits as low as 5%. Sounds helpful, right? But a 5% deposit on a £300,000 home is still £15,000, and it comes with significantly higher mortgage rates because lenders view low deposit mortgages as riskier. Your monthly payments end up higher, eating into your already limited income. And you need to be able to borrow at least 4.5 times your salary, often more. For someone earning £33,000, that means borrowing about £150,000, which only gets you a modest property even in cheaper regions. There was brief excitement when Yorkshire Building Society launched a 1% deposit mortgage. You could buy a £500,000 property with just £5,000 down. Sounds revolutionary, but you need to earn over £100,000 annually to qualify for the borrowing required. How many first-time buyers are earning that? It's a product designed for high earners who perhaps spent money on other things and didn't save a traditional deposit, not for ordinary people struggling to get on the ladder. It's a marketing headline that doesn't solve the real problem. Here's what 2 decades of research and data have made abundantly clear. The UK housing affordability crisis is not primarily a housing crisis. It's a wealth inequality crisis that manifests most visibly in housing because everyone needs somewhere to live. When wealth concentrates in fewer hands, those hands buy assets. Housing is an asset. The wealthy buy housing, either directly or indirectly through mortgage lending. This drives up prices. Ordinary people get outbid, they get priced out, they lose. Historical data supports this. After World War II, Britain experienced a long period of relatively high equality by historical standards. During those decades, housing was affordable. Working-class people could buy homes. The system functioned. Then, starting in the 1980s and accelerating after 2000, inequality began rising sharply. The wealthy got dramatically richer. Asset prices began their long climb. Housing affordability deteriorated in lockstep with rising inequality. It's not a coincidence, its cause and effect go further back. In the Victorian era, when Britain had extreme inequality, housing was not affordable for ordinary people. Workers lived in slums or cramped tenements. Home ownership was the privilege of the wealthy. We had a brief historical moment of broad-based home ownership in the mid-20th century, but that was the anomaly, not the norm. As inequality returns to Victorian-era levels, so does Victorian-era housing unaffordability. History is repeating because the underlying economic structures are reasserting themselves. The shape of British cities is changing because of this. Historically, when a country has extreme inequality, you get very different urban forms than in equal societies. In equal societies, workers and consumers are the same people, distributed relatively evenly. Cities develop with mixed neighbourhoods because everyone has some money, everyone needs services. But in highly unequal societies, wealth and consumption concentrate in a small elite. Workers need to live near that elite to access jobs and money. This creates cities with ultra-luxury centres surrounded by vast sprawls of poor quality housing. It's the model you see in many developing countries. London is increasingly moving towards that model. Luxury developments in zones 1 and 2, expensive commuter towns for the moderately wealthy, then rings of increasingly dense, low-quality housing in outer boroughs as developers pack people in cheaply. Some policy experts argue for aggressive house building in outer areas and new towns to ease pressure. But without addressing inequality, this just creates segregated geography. The wealthy stay in desirable central areas. Everyone else gets pushed to peripheries with limited infrastructure, poor transport links, and cheap construction. It's not solving the crisis, it's managing the crisis by spatially separating winners from losers. The budget speculation that froze the market in late 2025 wasn't baseless paranoia. Governments around the world are wrestling with how to raise revenue without further destroying economic growth. Property taxes are attractive because property can't move. If you tax income too heavily, people might work less or leave the country. If you tax property, the property stays put. The landowner has to pay. Talk of replacing stamp duty with annual property taxes, of higher council tax bans, of capital gains tax on expensive purchases. All of this is in the air because governments are desperate for revenue. But here's the trap. If you tax property ownership more heavily, you make it even less accessible to ordinary people while barely affecting the wealthy. The rich can absorb higher taxes. Someone struggling to make mortgage payments can't. Every new property tax pushes more marginal buyers out of the market. It might feel good politically to tax property because it seems like taxing wealth. But unless structured very carefully, it ends up taxing aspiration while leaving concentrated wealth largely untouched. What would actually help? Policies that directly address wealth concentration, higher taxes on wealth, capital gains, and inheritance, lower taxes on work and earned income, massive investment in social housing that operates outside the speculative market, regulations that limit how much of the housing stock can be owned by investors rather than residents, rent controls paired with guaranteed housing supply increases. These are difficult, complex policies that face fierce opposition from wealthy interests. So they don't happen. Instead, we get build, 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 which sounds simple but doesn't address the core problem. The UK housing crisis is at an inflection point. The system has broken down to such an extent that it's no longer functioning as a market in many areas. Buyers don't exist at current prices, sellers can't sell, renters can't afford rents but have no alternative. First-time buyers are locked out entirely unless they have family wealth. Each year, millions more people fall behind. The 2.2 million missing buyers since 2008 will become 3 million, then 4 million. The age of first-time buyers will keep climbing. Generation rent will become the permanent reality for larger and larger portions of the population. What happens when home ownership becomes the exclusive preserve of those who inherit it? When property ownership is passed down through families rather than earned through work, you get a society divided into a property-owning class and a permanently renting class. The property-owning class accumulates wealth through asset appreciation. The renting class pays rent to the property-owning class, transferring wealth upward. This isn't capitalism in the traditional sense of rewarding productive work. It's rentier capitalism, where wealth comes from ownership rather than labour. The political implications are profound. Historically, home ownership created political stability. People with mortgages and property had a stake in the system. They voted for continuity and gradual change. What happens when half the population has no property and no realistic prospect of ever getting any? Political volatility increases. Support for radical change grows. The social contract phrase. We're seeing early signs of this already. Younger generations vote very differently from older generations, and housing is a major driver of that divide. Britain is not alone in this. Similar dynamics are playing out across much of the developed world. Vancouver, Sydney, Auckland, San Francisco, all facing versions of the same crisis. Young people priced out. Wealth concentration driving asset prices beyond reach. Governments struggling to respond effectively. The crisis is global because the underlying forces, rising inequality and wealth concentration, are global. Any solution has to grapple with that reality. So where does this leave us? The average house price in the UK is £270,000. The average first-time buyer needs over £60,000 for a deposit. In London, that climbs to £125,000. Rents are consuming 44% of wages, making saving impossible for most people. Stamp duty changes in April 2025 added thousands in costs for first-time buyers. 2.2 million potential buyers have been locked out since 2008. The average age of first-time buyers is 33 and climbing. Regional disparities show the market has fractured into affordable and unaffordable zones. Behind all of these statistics is a simple truth. Housing has become unaffordable because wealth has become extremely concentrated. Ordinary people are competing with the very wealthy for assets, including homes. They're losing that competition, and they'll keep losing it until the fundamental distribution of wealth and economic power changes. Build More solutions don't address this. Stamp duty tweaks don't address this. Mortgage schemes don't address this. They're treating symptoms while the disease progresses. The question facing Britain is whether this is acceptable. Is it acceptable for home ownership to become hereditary? Is it acceptable for an entire generation to rent permanently? Is it acceptable for families to be forced into poor quality housing or geographic displacement? These are political and social questions, not just economic ones. The market has given its answer. Prices are what they are because wealthy buyers can pay them. If society wants a different outcome, society will have to intervene in ways that directly challenge wealth concentration and asset ownership patterns. Nothing about this is inevitable. Policy choices created this situation. Different policy choices could change it. But those different choices would require confronting very powerful interests, redistributing resources and wealth, and accepting that the current system benefits some people enormously while harming others. That's a difficult political fight. It's much easier to say, build more houses and hope the problem solves itself. It won't. The data shows it won't. Every year we pretend otherwise is another year the crisis deepens. The UK housing market in 2025 is not a market in any meaningful sense in large parts of the country. It's a system where wealth buys assets and ordinary people get squeezed out. Understanding that is the first step toward changing it. The question is whether there's political will to take the second step,